tonight's lesson, the title of tonight's lesson is SOS. And we're going to be looking at the book of the Bible known as what? Song of Solomon or Song of Songs? Well, yeah, we are in the Song of Solomon, which is the name of the book in the KJV translation, as well as the ESV translation, but it is also known as the Song of Songs because of the very first line, the very first verse of that book, which, if you want to turn there and get your bookmark in the book, says these words: the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. So yeah, it's been interchangeable titles there, and I may use them interchangeably. But we're going to treat on both. I mean, there's significance to both names. And Song of Songs, when you call it the Song of Songs, as it does here, it is like saying the Holy of Holies, right? Or the King of Kings. And it's a Hebrew turn of phrase that simply means this is the ultimate of that thing. This is the pinnacle, the best. You don't top this in its category, in its field. So the Song of Songs is the ultimate song, which is, yeah, I know. It's like, really? Come on. I looked up the number one song in our lifetime, right? For comparison's sake. Like, the Bible claims this is the Song of Songs, but what does America say? The number one song of the past 50 years, our lifetime, roughly, is, anybody want to guess? Take a stab, come on. What's an uber popular song? You can pick any genre. This is based on, okay, I'll tell you what. This list was based on Billboard standing records and like length of time at number one and stuff. Okay, the number one song of all time is The Twist by Chubby Checker. Yeah, that one. That's the Song of Songs, according to America? Please, that's terrible. Also on the list was Uptown Funk, which, okay, I'm closer to getting behind that. But no, we're going to be looking at the Song of Songs in this study. It'll be probably about 3 weeks we'll spend looking at this book. Now, what prompted me to want to do a little series on the Song of Solomon was this book called Full of Eyes, a visual exegesis of passages in the Bible, where this illustrator does a wildly imaginative job of depicting Christ in all parts of Scripture. So messianic allusions, which of course in the unified story of the Bible that points to Jesus are everywhere, and he illustrates them in these really creative ways. And for 3 days in a row, it goes like day by day, so it's kind of like a daily devotional. For 3 days, he did passages from the Song of Songs. And the first passage that he did was Song of Songs 2:10 through 12. Rise up, my love, my beautiful one, and come away. For behold, the winter is past. The rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth. The time of singing has come. And I know it's going to be hard for everybody to see. I'm going to hold it up anyway just in case. But the image is the outline of Christ. And he's like full of like spring, summer scenes. and he's crowning with his nail-scarred hand a woman standing in winter waste. And so the winter is past, the flowers are beginning to appear, and we see Christ adorning his beloved in that image. Song of Songs 4:7 is the next day. You are altogether beautiful, my darling, and there is no blemish in you. Now this he puts right next to Ephesians 5:25, which says, Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might present the church to himself in glory, not having a spot or wrinkle or any such thing. So there he's putting the no blemish in you line in Song of Songs and the beauty there with this verse in Ephesians about Christ presenting the church spotless and blemish free to himself. This one is a pretty wild image. He depicts Christ embracing his beloved in front of the tomb. And what's awesome here is there's an image of the cross passing through his heel and the serpent's head, which is kind of cool. He's got some pretty wild stuff in here, but that's the second day. And then the third day, Song of Songs 8:6. Love is strong as death. Jealousy is as fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flame of Yahweh. This was my favorite. This is what sealed the deal for me. Okay, it's at the conclusion, or in the conclusion of the Song of Songs, and this image is just incredible. It is Christ on the cross with a flame around him and rising up from him. And then there's this skull representing death coming down to consume Christ on the cross. But the flame is bursting through the skull in the form of Jesus' resurrected hand. It's so cool. And so his commentary here is, and by the resurrection of Christ, Yahweh shows that his love is stronger than death, and his jealousy for his bride and the glory of his name is fiercer than the grave. I was just like, man, Song of Songs is epic. Let's learn more about that. So that's what inspired it. And yeah, Song of Solomon, I mean, I have limited experience with the Song of Solomon. I have read it, of course, a couple of times, but you don't, it's not commonly treated. And it's that book that I do know of and think of as an allegory of Christ and the church. It's that allegory of Christ and the church book that we never talk about. But why don't we? Why don't we? Yeah, because it's embarrassing. We don't talk about it because it's embarrassing. And it is, it's makes us blush when we read it. There are parts about it that are, like a little uncomfortable. Also, it's, as a whole, beyond even just those parts, it is kind of weird. It's hard to get a hold of. And it's different. It's different than every other book of the Bible in so many ways. And that spiritual interpretation, the allegorical interpretation, like from that exegesis, it doesn't leap off the page when you read through the Song of Songs. So you ask the question, why did God choose this form? Why did God choose this style in this book for his Song of Songs, for his ultimate song? What's going on with that? Why is it so hard? Why is it so weird? Why is it embarrassing? And another part to that whole layer of it being weird is it's exotic. Stylistically, it's an exotic kind of book with lots of references to, kind of foreign things and concepts and imagery. It is a little bit hard to follow in terms of, plot, storyline, what's really going on there. And yeah, it's embarrassing because it is a semi-erotic book. It's semi-erotic literature. Erotic from the Greek word eros, or love that is really full of passion for another. And Christianity Christianity is not defined by eros, is it? We don't define ourselves by that. We don't strongly associate with it. We are agape people. That's God's love, right? Is agape love. Eros is that love that comes all too naturally, whereas agape has to be learned. So I think that's part of why we kind of relegate Song of Songs to the shelf and don't spend much time there, because we can be maybe a little weary of it. And we're going to look a little bit more at that next week. But another thing I'll say is I think we also tend to associate the Song of Solomon with the worst of Solomon as a figure in the Bible. Solomon, the man of God who wisely asked for wisdom, who held so much promise as the son of David, and did so much to bring glory, and really to bring, if you read about his rule and his reign, he brings at his best so much like Eden imagery and restoration to Israel and to Jerusalem. But then he also is that pivot point of Israel's descent and kind of point of no return in terms of turning away from God. And what turned him away? It was his heart. It was his going after other women, many other women who worshiped other gods. And this is his song. Like, Lord, why is this the Song of Songs? Like, surely this is a slippery slope. Surely this is a problem. And is that how we're supposed to read this as a book of warning? I don't think so. It's again, we'll look at it more next week, but really, I think it's a book of hope. But tonight's lesson is entitled SOS, for Save Our Song. That's what I wanted to call this lesson, Save Our Song. Rather than struggle to read past the human romance going on in these 8 chapters, we're going to take some time to unpack this poem's form and its patterns and its interplay with the rest of the Bible. There's really so much more of that than I ever realized, as it is part of this unified story that leads to Jesus. So we'll look at those hyperlinks and see what's being drawn on in that conversation. But my goal for us is to come away with an answer to the question, why is this here? Why is this the Song of Songs? Is it, what is God saying to us through it? And come to appreciate this well-known but little understood book. Yeah. If you imagine that Solomon was this faithful, monogamous romantic, then it's like, oh, this is beautiful. What a gorgeous book. But we don't come with that lens, I think, to it. We come with the lens of Solomon in our heads, and we're like, ooh, like, whoa, this guy is racy. That's not really what's going on here. So that's what we're going to unpack and we're going to get rid of those ghosts, hopefully. All right. And apparently this is a really popular topic because the audience is packed tonight. People came out for this in a big way. Okay, so what is going on in this book? Let's start by looking at the characters and the subject matter, or the plot, if you can call it that. In my Bible, in my Bible, they have broken out speakers into three different characters. She, others, and he. Do your Bibles have any such delineation? Yours does the same thing? Yeah, the ESV. So the ESV does that. It groups them by those three titles: she, others, and he. And that's in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, you can tell the gender of the speaker by the little grammatical cues, or the way they conjugate words, the way they conjugate verbs. You can tell if it's a woman speaking, a man speaking, and then of course with the others, that's when when plurals are used in reference to them. So the he, the she, and this chorus of people, the breakdown across the book is that the he makes up about 30%, this male voice, 30%. The she makes up 60%, and then the chorus is about 10%, 30, 60, 10. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll see in most of the places where those others chime in, they're called the Daughters of Jerusalem. So yeah, it does appear to be the young women, representing the young women of Jerusalem or Israel as a whole. But yeah, I don't think, I don't remember like most Bibles having that delineation kind of in the way it's structured. But of course, I think we all knew that there was this male figure and a female figure. At the very least, and they are the central characters. Now, who are these people? Who is this guy and who is this girl? So Christian tradition draws heavily from Ephesians chapter 5 for the well-known allegorical interpretation that the man represents Christ and the woman represents his church. That's Ephesians 5:25 through 33. Part of that was read in this visual exegesis book. But Ephesians 5:25, this letter from Paul, Paul is exhorting husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church, giving himself up for her, sanctifying her, cleansing her, that he might present the church to himself, again, like without blemish, spot, or wrinkle. He says, husbands, love your wives as your own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. And then this mystery is profound, verse 32. And I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. And so this, what Paul talks about in terms of the relationship of a man and wife being this picture of Christ and the church, that gets read back onto the Song of Solomon and the figures here being talked about. Another dominant interpretation is an allegorical reading where the woman is actually representing God in Song of Solomon, and the man is representing Israel. And the song or the poem is this picture or song of God's covenant relationship with Israel. And this will actually make, this may be an unfamiliar idea, but it actually makes a lot of sense in light of some things we'll look at later. For example, kind of the pattern of the narrative or the pattern of the story, some of the things mentioned map on very well to Israel's own history. There are these cycles of a seeking and coming together, and then separation, and then a seeking and coming together and separation. So there's been kind of a mapping onto that pattern, and we're also going to look at the book of Proverbs, also in the tradition of Solomon, Solomon's wisdom. Proverbs 1 through 9 talks all about a female figure known as Wisdom. Yeah, Lady Wisdom. And so Lady Wisdom there, if we are associating Song of Songs with the wisdom of Solomon and the work of Solomon, that is a natural connection to make, and should kind of set off some bells there. So we'll look more at that, but those are two kind of allegorical interpretations, both of which are driving at the same ultimate point, that it is a picture of God's love for his people and what that loving relationship looks like, the hope and the regenerative nature of love and so on. So are the male and female attributions being different in those two interpretations? Is that important? Does that matter? Are they mutually exclusive? The fact that one says, oh no, the woman is God, the man is God, however you look at it. My working hypothesis is that it's not ultimately so important and problematic. I'm open to learning differently, but what I want to do is just look at what the text says for now. Just look at the text, look at Song of Solomon, and see who does the text say that they are. Which is actually a bit tricky to pin down. And that's not by accident, I think. That there's such kind of an abstract nature to these two figures, but we'll look at a couple of the ways that they're talked about and described. All right, first, is the man in this story, is he Solomon? Which verse are you reading? Between verses 7 and 8? Oh, okay. Interesting. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, some believe, some theorize it may be a young Solomon with his first wife. The figures, the male and the female, they are not married at this point, but they appear to be betrothed or engaged. They're courting one another. But yeah, on the question of, is the man Solomon? So Solomon his name does appear in here. Huh? Yeah, his name does appear throughout the book a total of 7 times. So you'll see it in, of course, the opening line that this is of Solomon. You see it in chapter 1, verse 5. So you see it twice at the beginning. Then you see it in chapter 3 a couple of times. So 3:7, 3:9, and 3:11. Solomon's name comes up. And then in chapter 8 at the end, verses 11 and 12. So Solomon's the only proper name in the book. It appears 7 times in this kind of symmetrical layout in the book. But here's something interesting. Solomon is never the speaker in the Song of Solomon. He's never speaking in first person or addressed first person. He's always a third person figure. And so the he, how else is the he described? The he, and this is another reason I think we tend to tie the he to Solomon, is if you look at chapter 1, verse 4, right here in the introduction, it says, "Draw me after you." This is the she speaking. "Draw me after you, let us run. The king has brought me into his chambers." So, King Solomon, right? King Solomon is the one bringing me into his chambers. But the rest of the time, she goes on to speak of and to her beloved. He is described and talked about as more of a shepherd figure. There's shepherd, imagery and descriptions ascribed to him throughout the rest of the text. It starts in chapter 1, verse 7. "Tell me, you whom my soul loves, where you pasture your flock, where you make it lie down at noon. For why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions?" And that imagery, that shepherd attribution, continues on and is really the predominant way that he's described, aside from his physical appearance. That's really kind of the only title that he holds. And then when Solomon comes in, the few times that he does, he is, again, referred to in kind of a third-party way. Let's look at chapter 3, verse 7. We'll start in verse 6. "What is coming up from the wilderness, like columns of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all the fragrant powders of a merchant? Behold, it is the litter of Solomon. Around it are 60 mighty men, some of the mighty men of Israel, all of them wearing swords and expert in war, each with his sword at his thigh against terror by night. King Solomon made himself a carriage from the wood of Lebanon. He made its posts of silver, etc., etc. Go out, O daughters of Zion, and look upon King Solomon, with the crown with which his mother crowned him on the day of his wedding, on the day of the gladness of his heart." So this picture that she's painting and describing is not the personal one of longing, of ownership, of relationship that she has with the rest of the he. And then a kind of a funky thing happens at the end in chapter 8 when Solomon comes up. Chapter 8, verses 11 and 12. It says, "Solomon had a vineyard at Baal Haman. He let out the vineyard to keepers. Each one was to bring for its fruit 1,000 pieces of silver. My vineyard, my very own, is before me. You, O Solomon, may have the 1,000, and the keepers of the fruit 200. I don't know what any of that means. It's kind of strange and cryptic to me, but again, it isn't that same kind of personal address. Instead, Solomon is almost this foil. He's presented as this other. He is this kind of third figure that is there. We are clearly, from the very first line, meant to associate this song with Solomon, but it is not an autobiography of his love life. And that is, I think, very important. So the he, what we know is that it is a man. We know that he is a shepherd. That's kind of his predominant description. And that he has this relationship with the she. Now, who is the she? She is described in many ways, but she's not really given any title other than in 6:13, chapter 6, verse 13. She is called the Shulamite. "Return, return, O Shulamite, return, return, that we may look upon you. Why should you look upon the Shulamite as upon a dance before two armies?" So what's a Shulamite? is a Shulamite. I mean, by the name, it suggests someone of a certain people or country, like Shulem. Um, this is not, this is part of kind of this exotic flair and this otherworldliness that the book has. Shulem doesn't seem to be a known country or people. And what's interesting about that title is it is the feminine form of Solomon's own name. So in the Hebrew, Solomon has a great name, okay? His Hebrew name is Shlomo. Hilarious. And Shulamite is it's like the equivalent of calling him Solomina, or having the name Solomina, it's like a feminization of it. So that's another association that we have with Solomon there in her name, somehow associating their names together, calling her the Shulamite or the Miss Shlomo lady. But otherwise, she is described, she's described in other ways that we'll look at, but none that are particularly identifying. We'll see how she is swarthy, made dark by the sun from working in the vineyards. And then, we have these others who are young women, daughters of Jerusalem. And as we go on, we'll see more how these figures interact, their relationships, how they talk about one another, and it'll shed a little more light on them, but it is ultimately kind of just a young man and a young woman who, in terms of the subject matter and the plot, they really like each other. Let's read the introduction. Let's read through the introduction altogether of the Song of Solomon. This is chapter 1, verses 2 through 7. The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Oh, by the way, I'll say too, one time I attended a church while I was in college where they did the Song of Solomon series, where every Sunday at the beginning they would have a man and a woman come up and read the parts of the man and the woman up at the pulpit, which I thought was really interesting. And then there was the sermon. Huh? Is that? Yeah, no. I was like, Lucy, come on, you got it. No, that is not why she's not here. The Song of Song, which is Solomon's. The woman says, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine." Okay, so this dives right in. Like, right away, this is love poetry, right? No bones about it. This is love poetry. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Your anointing oils are fragrant. Your name is oil poured out. Therefore virgins love you. Draw me after you. Let us run. The king has brought me into his chambers. We will exult and rejoice in you. We will extol your love more than wine. Rightly do they love you. She comes back in. I am very dark, but lovely. O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has looked upon me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. Tell me, you whom my soul loves, where you pasture your flock, where you make it lie down at noon. For why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? So these two are not yet together. She says in verse 4, to draw me after you, let us run. And she addresses kind of the chorus, but she and her love are not together at the introduction. They're not together at the beginning. And we're going to see that at times they do come together. And then there's this pattern of coming together, kind of builds this like anticipation and excitement, and then they're apart again. And it kind of starts over. And then they come together. And then it breaks. So as a whole, if you read through it, it is kind of a meandering form. It's meandering like poetry. It's like a collection of poems that don't have a particularly rigid structure. They don't have a tight narrative arc or anything like that. It's a lot of poetic descriptions and words and, interjections from the chorus and so on. But what's helpful to notice as you read through it is there's a lot of repetition. That repetition helps provide some meaningful anchor to the understanding and to what you're kind of letting wash over you as you read. There are images repeated again and again, certain images and ideas. We're going to look at some of those, like a big one is garden imagery. There's a lot of garden imagery. Vineyards and wine are a really common theme. Fragrance is very common. But there are two major themes with those multiple sub-themes underneath them. The first is that cycle that I mentioned, where there is expression of longing, this effusive, like pining after the other. And then that becomes seeking, translates to seeking. I want to be with, I want to have him or her, go after, be together. Then they do find each other. Going to see a couple of those repeated times when they're together. And then there's separation, and they're no longer together, and that kind of pattern starts over again. The cycle starts over again. And this happens, I think 3 times. I have to double check that. I think it happens about 3 times. And that cycle, every time, is kind of driving this anticipation, the anticipation of consummation, like let's be together at last, let's really, be one. But even to the very end of the book, it's never fully realized. It's never resolved. Even at the end, the book ends with separation and doesn't fully resolve. And I think that's significant and meaningful in terms of its allegorical application and claims it's making about love. That's theme number 1. theme 2 is the one that is embarrassing. And that's the joy of physical attraction. And you see this especially in the times when they are together and they have found each other. They are just delighted, in the fullest sense of the word. They are delighted with each other in a way that isn't simply a detached admiration of the other's beauty, like, man, you are just so good looking. It's they're not a sunset. they desire one another, and one of the sub themes, in that is you're going to see language of consumption come up again and again. There's repetition of this language and idea of like wanting to consume the other person, and it's very possessive. It's very personal, and it's a very physical attraction that's depicted in this kind of love poetry. And something like a literary device that's used in Song of Solomon as well as in other love poetry. This was a common literary style in ancient cultures that were contemporary with Israel. Other cultures would have their own love poetry that was kind of formatted in similar ways and used kind of similar elements and ideas. We're going to talk more next week about really how God's Song of Songs stands in contrast to the world's sense of love and its glorification of love. But a device that was common in all this love poetry, and there's a name for it, that probably only 2 people in the world have ever heard of, but it's a name for this thing that you read when they come together where they describe each other. They describe each other's bodies, and you notice that they describe from the toe all the way up to the head and back down again. And they use this flowery language, these metaphorical images, and the metaphors that they use to describe one another are not meant to be primarily visual metaphors. When it's talking about like your hair is like a flock of goats, we're not supposed to be picturing a flock of goats on the other person's head. Instead, you have to kind of meditate on the meaning, kind of a deeper meaning to each of those pictures that isn't primarily visual but might be qualitative or related to some other attribute of the description. So if you watch the Bible Project's video about the Song of Solomon, they do animated videos and they try doing a sketch of what the beloved would look like if they looked like how they were described, and it's terrifying. So don't think of it primarily visually is the takeaway there. But yeah, that's it's just a common part of love poetry is to express what you see and appreciate and love in the other, using this language. So that's all part of that theme of just the joy of physical attraction and just the great kind of love they have for one another, overflowing into that those descriptions. So these themes, the cycle of longing, seeking, finding, and separation, and this joy of physical attraction, it's all swirling around in here for 8 chapters in this drawn-out meditation on love, right up to the conclusion in chapter 8. Chapter 8 verses 6 through 14 is considered the conclusion. And we read it actually in the beginning there from the visual exegesis book, really what kind of drives home in a big way the point and the message of the book in a lot of ways. It says, "Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love is strong as death, jealousy is fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flame of the Lord. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, he would be utterly despised." And so we'll unpack more that in next week's lesson. But I think even here in these two verses, we see some of what makes us uneasy with the Song of Solomon to begin with. That love can be described as as strong as death, fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, and many waters cannot quench it. There's a potential. There's both great promise and blessing, but also potential for destruction and calamity and issues that can come with love. And I don't think that this book, as we'll look at it more, shies away from any of that, but reinforces it in pretty cool ways, again, in ways that set it apart from other love poetry. So that is it for tonight, all we have time for, but we'll pick up again next week, review all that, recap all that, and then start looking at the hyperlinks to other parts of the Bible. We'll look at Genesis, we'll look at Proverbs, Revelation, and more. So any questions or thoughts right now? You're confused? If what I'll say is this: I think there's room to be able to say that it's Solomon, but that there are problems with thinking of it as Solomon. Yeah, that if it's Solomon, that it is kind of a version of Solomon that isn't really true to life. It's not autobiographical, but that there's something like with the other parts of wisdom literature where, it's being used to like teach a lesson or tell a story rather than to be taken literally.
It's really hard because all the references to Solomon are of a rich and well-established Solomon, not a very young Solomon. Now, granted, his father was rich, so he was too, but
Mm-hmm.
it's more like he has a vineyard here, he has a vineyard, he's established, so it could be Solomon at an old age, speaking as if he was younger, like his first love. Or it could be, and the interpretation I've heard also is that this is Solomon writing about a young couple he saw. One of the people, one of the girls that worked for him,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the guards or somebody, and a young love and what he saw there, reminding him of his own young love and writing this song. So I mean, there's a lot of ways to look
Mm-hmm.
Who this is unclear.
Yeah. Yep.
But he's gonna have all those answers.
I'm not promising any answers because I'm not going to become an expert on Song of Songs in just a couple weeks, but we'll do our best. And those kinds of
Years before the book.
yeah, exactly, exactly, yeah. But no, like those kinds of questions are good and helpful to steer the lessons in the conversation. So yeah, we'll unpack it more next week.